Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam, and we're the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
Hello, hello. Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today we have Oscar Brekell joining us to this podcast. Welcome, Oscar.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so Oscar is a author of a number of very famous books related to Japanese tea and Japanese tea ceremony. So before we dive into this podcast, Oscar, can you share us a little bit about yourself, your personal background, and your professional background?
Absolutely. So I fell in love with Japanese tea when I was in high school. So it's more than 20 years ago now. And I started drinking not only sencha and gyokoro and kabusecha and those kind of teas, but actually matcha too. So way before the matcha boom happened. And I can tell you, this was a quite lonely endeavor at the time because none of my friends basically were interested in green tea, be it Chinese green tea or Japanese green tea or whatever. And I grew up in southern Sweden, and Sweden is essentially a coffee country. So that made the whole business of drinking green tea even lonelier. But I carried on for a couple of years, and then eventually I traveled to Japan. I fell in love even more with Japanese tea, and somewhere along the way, I decided I got this weird idea because people become sommeliers or baristas or whatever chocolate specialists, and I was thinking, hey, there's no green tea guy out there. Well, there wasn't really at the time anyway. So and I love Japan, Japanese culture, Japanese tea. And I was young and naive. I think I was 21 years old when I decided upon this. And I was like, hey, I'm going to be the tea specialist. I'm going to study Japanese and go over to Japan, study Japanese tea for a couple of years. And then I'll be the guy introducing Japanese tea overseas, which kind of happened. So to make a very, very long history or very long story short, and this is not a straight road, basically. A lot of things happen along the way, but eventually I did get my certification as as a tea instructor, a Japanese tea instructor. As you know, I've been writing a couple of books on the topic. They're available in English, Japanese, and actually there's a version in French as well. And what else is there to be said? Well, I did my tea training actually basically in Shizuoka prefecture, which is probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with as well. One of the biggest tea growing regions in Japan and one of the most important ones as well, because they do a lot of tea refining and blending as well, apart from just growing tea there. But they have a tea research center where they do things like breed new cultivars and just conduct different kinds of research on tea. And I was there for a year, and that's basically what I did, where I got my proper tea training. And ever since, I've been working actually for the
Incredible.
Japanese government. I've been working for myself as well. I have a company now, so I do have a small tea brand as well. But my main thing is basically I do tea lectures, tea events.
That was awesome. Super interesting. Actually, before we dive into what we talked about before for a good topic for an episode, just super curious, what goes on behind the curtain at these tea research institutes across Japan? We've walked by the one in Kyoto and we were like, oh, I wonder what's going. We've heard about what goes on in there in terms of breeding and selecting new cultivars, but I still don't have a very good understanding of what's going on in these centers.
I actually need to ask you a question, Ryan. So you walked around it, but you actually didn't enter?
No, we were just walking around, the general area. It was, 5 PM too. It was on a weird random weekday. We were trying to get a sense of how much Honzu shading was actually happening in Uji. So we spent 5 or 6 hours just walking around everywhere, and we were actually quite depressed by, 1, the number of abandoned tea farms. Even next to Ogonoyama Tea Garden, 1 block down the street, there's an abandoned tea garden, what's, arguably one of the best areas to grow tea, and then Honzu shading, I think what did we see, Sam? 4 or 5?
Yeah, 4 or 5, and there's more.
Because I was gonna say probably very little.
Yeah.
Okay, so what goes on? Well, it really depends on where you are, basically. So, for example, the place where you didn't enter in Uji, they're mainly focused on breeding cultivars for matcha and for any shaded teas. Whereas, for example, in a place like Shizuoka, they have been at least until recently more focused on sencha, but they're also doing a lot of other things. So it's not only about cultivar breeding; it's also about things like how does different kinds of fertilizers affect the tea plant and the nutrients in the tea leaves and so forth, and how does that affect the taste and the flavor, and of course the soil, those kind of things. And you have research on pesticides as well, those kind of things. And then they also do research on different kinds of processing tea. So they're experimenting with, things like withering, and it's fun actually. It's very fun to be there because, especially, well, I can only speak for the prefectural one in Shizuoka because that was one where I did my training. But it's a very fun place to be if you're a tea lover, a tea enthusiast, or anyone who wants to learn about tea, because basically they have equipment for making lots of different kinds of teas. So obviously, we have a factory for making sencha. We have a factory for making oolong tea. We have actually a factory for making black tea as well. So we were doing all that, and I think actually for me, one of the most well, rewarding and kind of interesting things to do was that we had, because when you do cultivar breeding, essentially what you have is like sometimes just one single tea plant, and you try to pluck tea leaves in spring to make tea from that. It's like too little. Tea leaves are they're basically not enough for processing sencha in a normal factory. So what we had was like a kind of look like toy factory, or kind of like, not as in a place where they make toys, but a factory for toys where, Barbie dolls could work on processing teas, or stuffed dolls or something. Like everything is smaller. So you have tea rollers, steamers, everything is like tiny, because you want to be able to make tea from those new kind of cultivar candidates. The new candidates, for the record, don't have a name yet. They just have a number. But you want to see how do they taste like. And funny thing is, you do tea evaluation as well a lot. So you have like 30, 40 different samples in front of you, and you do tea evaluation. Turns out that most of them taste awful, bitter, it's like awfully astringent or something, and you just discard them basically. And they told me that, because I was there for a year, and a lot of people that have been working with cultivar breeding for like, 5, 6 years or even more, they said, well, basically our job is to throw things away. So, but there was another scientist actually there, or another researcher, and he said, well, actually, you can modify that bit, saying that, well, among all the different candidates for becoming a new cultivar that we breed, our job is, well, of course, partly to discard or throw all these cultivar candidates away, but then again, it's also our job to pick something up, keep something that has a very, very good taste, for example. It also be that particular tea plant is very strong towards frost, or different kinds of disease. But yeah, it was very interesting, and you do learn a lot. And even in winter, because there's not a lot to do at a tea farm, and that includes the tea farms. There's not a lot to do in winter, but they had like the best library ever. A lot of tea books that are not printed anymore, and so forth. So I was very happy by that time that I did spend most of my adult life learning Japanese, because that's really a big life project. But it turned out to be to pay off. I was able to do or study about tea at the Tea Research Center.
Very interesting. How does the knowledge getting transferred from the institute to the actual farmers or the factories? Like, is there a mechanism or like some sort of education organization that does that, or the institute does it themselves?
So actually, contrary to what you might think, you can basically visit a tea research center anytime. You might want to give them a heads up if you want them to guide you or something, but they're basically open to the public, and especially if you're not restricted to, but especially if you are a Shizuoka resident, and if you're a tea farmer, you could basically go there anywhere, just well, I mean, anytime, just to keep yourself updated on the latest news, whatever. If you want to get in touch with the researchers, and actually, there are some farmers that are really interested in new cultivars in particular. Because if you're a tea farmer, if
Mhm.
you want to do something different from everybody else, everyone's doing Yabukita, for example, though, and not recently, a lot of people are doing Tsuhikari. So there are like some of the cultivars that a lot of people or a lot of farmers are doing, but maybe if you're a tea farmer, and if you want to do something unique just to stand out, what you can do is you can go to the Tea Research Center and become one of those farmers who experiment with a new unregistered cultivars, or not yet registered cultivars. So, and they do things like, seminars and different kinds of gatherings. And I think they're quite in close in contact with not only tea farmers, but, anyone in the business basically. And also people working for the prefecture. So when I was there, and I was there for a year, and I felt like people were, coming in and out all the time, and basically we, especially, I mean, tea industry people, but also media. So I think they're always like and very closely connected to the public.
So
That's
we can just walk in and like
yeah,
spend the
you
day
can walk
there.
in, but you might want to give them a heads up, especially if you're a foreigner, and especially if you don't speak Japanese. You might want to have a Japanese speaker with you who could, translate. Uh, it's quite fun to visit, actually. I think I highly recommend it, actually, especially the kind of mini tea factory that I was talking about earlier. Both, I think, Kyoto is the one in Kyoto, the one in Uji is. I think they renewed it. It's probably maybe more than 10 years ago now, but it's a quite nice looking building. And actually, the one in Shizuoka too. When I was there, it's quite run down, and uh, they certainly needed some renovation. And guess what? It's actually done now. It's in a place called Kikugawa City, but the whole area is called Makinohara Daichi, which is like a plateau, basically, more or less, with basically only tea farms and some residential areas. But there's like tea farms as far as you can see, basically. And then there's this tea research center that finally looks nice now.
It's supported by MAF, like the Ministry of Agriculture and Fishery Forestry.
So actually, this is very confusing, but there are two different research centers on the same road, but they're in different municipalities. The one is in Shimada, and that one is very close to the tea museum, by the way, they have there. So that's another reason for visiting that area. This is in the central part of Shizuoka. But that one is actually the National Tea Research Center, which is sponsored by the Ministry of Agriculture in Japan, as you mentioned. And there's another
Yeah.
one further down the road, which is not a national research center. It's a prefectural. So it's run by the Shizuoka prefectural government. And that's the one where I was at. I guess so. This is essentially a matcha podcast, but if listeners are somewhat familiar with the Sencha and Sencha cultivars, just to drop a few names here, some of the cultivars that were bred at the Tea Research Center in Shizuoka would be Koshin, for example, very floral,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
and what else? Yamakai, for example. I just name a few.
Both Sam and I got to try koshin when we were at Koto Tea Space in Bangkok
Yeah,
from
yeah.
your
I think
brand.
you mentioned that. Oh,
Yeah.
great that you're mentioning Koto, by the way. I just came back from a series of sessions. One of the best tea shops or tea spaces in the world, I said.
I don't like classifying myself as someone who doesn't like sencha. I think I just don't like most sencha, but actually it was the koshin cultivar from your brand, Senchaism, that they brewed that really opened my mind. Okay, wow, there's more dimensions to this than I thought. And what they do with variable temperature extraction is really interesting, where they start cold and get hotter and hotter. It was also kind of made me see sencha in a really new way. It's pretty inspiring for my own like personal brewing. Even for matcha, like I've started to experiment with these variable temperatures.
It's great to hear, actually, because I remember having Koshin for the first time. I was back in 2013. I just moved to Tokyo, and I was basically one of those salarymen. I had a corporate job here in Japan. I was working for a Japanese company, and I was trying to get my tea instructor certificate, which was kind of hard to study on the side because, long working hours, a lot of late night work, basically, and a lot of, drinking with your colleagues, all those kind of things. But I kept studying tea, and I went to this workshop held by a Japanese tea instructor just to motivate myself. This was on a weekend, quite early after I had moved to Japan. I was served koshin. I just thought it was amazing. It's like, I had this image of sencha in my head being mostly about the green flavors, and it's being a good balance of astringency, umami, all those kind of things, and but mainly about the green flavors, kind of forest like aromas going on. And then koshin has something completely different. It's like floral, herbal, and then it's like a cinnamon-like aftertaste. I thought it was great. So it kind of changed my perception of sencha, and that was after having been drinking sencha for 10 years or so. So it's wonderful to hear that a lot of other people out there get a similar reaction.
I have a question about the research institutes and just the general structure of these different government bodies in Japan. There's like the auction houses, like you hear about the Shizuoka auction house and the Kyoto one. And that system, and then you have these research centers, and then you have the cooperatives. And I know like the Kyoto Tea Cooperative Association's like enormous. It's like 160 members or 130, something like that. how do these different entities interact with each other? And how are they funded? Is it all from government support? Is it self-supported? Is what's that? The ecosystem is a little fuzzy in how all of that's connected.
So basically, the research centers, they're entirely tax funded. So they're
Okay,
either government funded, as in funded through or via the Minister of Agriculture, or one of the prefectural governments.
okay,
So, for example, in the case of the Shizuoka Tea Research Center, they are funded by the whole organization. The premises, everything is funded by the local government, as in the prefectural government. So that means that, for example, research at that particular tea research center is mainly aimed for benefiting tea farmers or anyone in tea in Shizuoka. Now, this is not always entirely possible because let's say you're from Mie or whatever, or some other fairly nearby place, and you go to Shizuoka and you want one of their cultivars. They're not very likely to stop you, as in, or, to say, no, we're not going to give our cultivars to you because you're not part of Shizuoka. So it's not like, not trying to, it's not like trying to stop like industrial espionage or something from,
okay,
foreigners coming in trying to find out things about your industry or something. It's not on that level, but there is. So, for example, in the case of Shizuoka, they think about the local climate whenever they are developing or breeding
okay.
new cultivars, those kind of things, and whatever research they conduct. The main premise would be, how does this benefit, or how would this benefit, or how would the results of this benefit the
Mm,
farmers or anyone in tea in the prefecture. So as for the other ones, cooperatives, they're mainly privately funded. So it's a completely
okay.
different thing. So, but if you're asking me about the ecosystem and how it works, I think the tea research centers, they're essentially open for everyone, actually. So you can, I mean, if you want to read the reports, if you want any information, you can get in touch with them. It's not like it's not like a private company.
Okay.
It's not like, okay, so we're developing this new whatever semiconductor and it's a lot better than our competitors. We don't want anyone to know about this or how we do it. Basically, so it's kind of the opposite way around, actually. So they do want people to use their cultivars. They do want people to.
Hmm.
Interesting. And do the institutes talk to each other as well?
The institutes, as in, the Shizuoka Prefectural Research Center and the national, for example, or
Yeah, or like other tea institutes from other regions. Like, do they like exchange their insights or
well, they
new
do, they do.
developments?
And I think there's a lot of personal interaction as well as in private, because if you're in tea and if you're doing research on tea, then this is a small world, so you're very likely to, let's say someone's doing research on fertilizers and you're doing it as well, then you're very likely to interact at some point. So I'd say yes, they do that, of course. And if there's been research on something at the national research center, they might make use of that in Shizuoka and vice versa.
Okay. Interesting. And the auction system is totally different, or it's tied to one of those two?
So those are a little different because they work different in different regions, different prefectures. So, for example, in some prefectures, you're only allowed to join if you're actually if your business is based in the prefecture. Whereas there are some places that are open for everyone. So you can actually be, for example, in Shizuoka, you can be from Tokyo, for example, and you can still go to the tea market in Shizuoka and purchase tea. Some of them are closed. So like the one in
I heard the one in Kagoshima is like super closed. It's like a little oligopoly of who can get that material.
I think so. I think it's maybe I think they work in a different way because I mean they've been developing along very different lines. For example, Shizuoka is, although being one of the biggest tea growing regions in Japan, still it was the biggest for a very long time. It has developed not only as a tea growing region, but also as a place where they do things like tea refining and also tea blending. So, for example, you mentioned Kagoshima. Actually, Kagoshima's biggest customer, most important customer, used to be Shizuoka. Not as a prefecture, obviously, but tea businesses in Shizuoka, taking as a whole. Until not so long ago, actually, if you were selling something, if you bought Shizuoka tea, it could actually contain a lot of tea from Kagoshima. They changed the rules and regulations, so if you want to sell something as Shizuoka tea, it has to be 100% made in Shizuoka. The raw tea, the aracha has to be 100% grown in Shizuoka. But that didn't used to be the case. So let's say if we rewind back to the 70s or something, they would still buy a lot of tea from Kagoshima blended with Shizuoka. So Shizuoka is essentially the name of a blend. I think since they developed along those lines, if you look at it, a place like Kagoshima, they kind of started out as an exporter, kind of in a way. I mean, they're not exporting overseas, but they're selling most of their teas to Shizuoka. Now, what they've been trying to do, and this is actually quite new. A lot of people are used to seeing teas like Chirancha and or Kagoshima tea, pure tea as in from Kagoshima as in containing only or from Kagoshima prefecture. This is quite a new phenomenon actually. So they used to ship their teas either to Shizuoka or to Uji. So I think that's kind of them kind of wanting to be in control and the tea industry. Whereas a place like Shizuoka, you probably benefit more from, having people coming in, tea vendors, tea dealers from places like Tokyo to come in and buy your tea because you already buy tea from a lot of different places. And basically your mission has been to push that kind of onwards or to different markets. Whereas in Kagoshima, it's about getting Kagoshima tea out basically only, and it's not you don't buy any tea from other prefectures and blend it in Kagoshima, at least not to a considerable degree at the moment. So that's probably why they have
Yeah,
different.
they're further
It's an
down the
ingredient.
supply chain.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
Interesting. Well, yeah, you can see, Oscar, this podcast expand way beyond the topic of matcha.
Exactly. But I think we're touching on subjects that are common for both leaf tea and matcha. I think when we were speaking a couple of weeks ago, I remember that we talked about, could you make cultivars that taste like koshin and then kind of turn it into matcha, making the matcha
Mm,
kind of floral or, herbal. And that makes it kind of interesting if you think of the possibility of that. I think, though, the answer is, at least for now, because we do kind of know actually, because you can try this. You can grow koshin or tsuyu hikari or some kind of floral fruity cultivar and shade it for 3 weeks if you want to make, let's say, you want to make proper matcha. And then you do all the things necessary. You hand pluck it and then you steam it and then you dry it without rolling. And finally, you take out the veins and everything. You do what you produce tencha basically, and then you mill that stone mill, and you end up with matcha. Will it taste kosher? Here's the interesting part. Probably not, because
yeah,
you shade for 3 weeks, right? So if you shade for 3 weeks, you get the shaded flavor, right? The kind of seaweed like. In Japan, it's quite common to describe it kind of as aonori, which is it's a type of seaweed um, that you put on okonomiyaki, very popular dish here. I think a lot of people probably like Japan, so like a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with okonomiyaki, but it's the kind of like powdery, uh, green bluish kind of seaweed powder that you put on okonomiyaki, and it has a similar flavor. Actually, there's a molecule in dimethyl sulfate that you get a lot of when you shade, especially if you shade for more than 10 days. You start getting this shaded aroma, or oika, as it is also called in Japanese.
yeah.
And as you get more oika, you lose other cultivar flavors. So your matcha is not going to taste like koshin, sadly. But then again, you never know, because I mean, if you look at, I don't know, maybe we should make a visit to the Uji research station, because I think what they probably have done so far is they've been developing or breeding cultivars that are good for shading. And
Mm,
I think, I mean, there are two perspectives here. One is the tea plant should be good at being shaded, as in it should not, get too weak from shading. So
mm.
it has to be, tolerant enough to the stress involved in being shaded. But I also think that, and this is actually similar to most cultivars when it comes to sencha, because in the case of sencha, we got yabukita, right, which is the main cultivar. And most of the other cultivars have actually been bred kind of in order to get mixed with or blended with yabukita. So cultivars like Koshu, Hikari, those kind of flavorful cultivars, it's a very new phenomenon. I think tea
Character.
exactly. I think people who, tea enthusiasts, aficionados, whatever, people that are into tea, leaf tea today, they want, the different flavors and different taste experiences. But that wasn't necessarily the case, let's say like 30, 40 years ago. Most teas were
Mm,
blended, and we didn't really have a single estate in the Japanese tea scene. So if you breed something like Koshin in the 70s or 60s, it's not going to pass. It's going to be discarded. It's going to be one of those cultivars that the researchers discard because it's too flavorful. It's not going to, be easy to blend. So you want something that tastes similar to Yabukita. And then if we jump back to matcha, I think, you know, we have cultivars like Samidori, Asahi, and Uji Hikari. And of course, they're a little bit different. But I mean, let's be honest, they're not like extremely different from each other. So if we go back to Sencha again, like Yabukita and Koshin, those are entirely different.
yeah.
Very different. I think they're like, this is like Pinot Noir and I don't know, Cabernet Sauvignon or something. I don't know if that's a good reference entirely, but it's not a perfect analogy. But if you can't separate those two, you probably didn't have a lot of red wine in your life. So, and same with Koshin and Yabukita, they're very, very different. Now, let's go back to Samidori and Asahi. Let's make a blind test. I mean, there's a difference. There is a difference. Of course it is. I mean, I think Asahi is a little more thick, like more avocado-like kind of in its texture and taste. It kind of grows in the mouth. Samidori tends to be a little bit more fresh. So there's a difference there. I mean, it's possible to make a mistake, right? I don't think it's possible to make a mistake if you compare Yabukita and Koshin, unless, there's something wrong happened during processing or something. But I think it's a lot more difficult when it comes to matcha. And this could actually be, one reason could be that most of the cultivars bred for matcha so far has been bred so as to kind of resemble each other because they're blends anyway. But
Yeah.
maybe because now we're thinking in a different way. Now people want different, flavor experiences, and people are looking for something more diverse. You don't want exactly the same thing every day. Also, I think this is not only consumers or tea drinkers, whatever. I think this is also about how tea companies work because you won't if you run a matcha company, you probably prefer that your matcha tastes a little bit different from your competitors, whatever. At least a
Uh-huh.
little different. So I think there's probably demand for making matcha that tastes quite different. Is it possible? And in that case, to what extent? I don't know actually. I think we need probably like, another 15, 20 years maybe before we could see like really strong flavored matcha.
That's interesting. The breeding's a slow process.
The purpose of breeding is, people are developing all these cultivars with the mindset of blending and, with
Yeah.
the mindset of maintaining consistency and with the mindset of not having one cultivar being too, different from the others. But I don't know. Yeah, like with all these global trend about single estate and single origin and single cultivar matcha, people are going to look for novelties. I don't know if that has cascaded down to the local production and tea research in Japan.
I think it has, but I think one thing everyone needs to understand is that it takes a lot of time to breed a cultivar. So basically, what you do is, let's say you have Yabukita, and so you need a flowering Yabukita, which happens in late October typically, but it depends a little on where in Japan you are. And then let's say you want to mix this Yabukita with or crossbreed it with, well, let's say Koshin. So what you do is you have a flowering Yabukita, and then you take pollen from a flowering Koshin and you insert that pollen into the flower. Then you put actually what you do is you put a small bag or kind of sack-looking thing on top of the flower because you don't want any other pollen coming in there. You want to make sure that you actually get the desired mix of those two. You can of course do it the other way around if you want the caution to be if you want caution to be the mother plant. You can do it the opposite way around. Anyway, you need two different flowers to get a seed, and if you're lucky, you get a seed next year. First of all, okay, so that's 1 year. You plant that a couple of months later in a small pot, and then you keep that in the greenhouse. And eventually, if you're lucky, you actually do get a small tea plant. And if that survives, you probably replant it in a kind of nursery just outside where you keep a lot of new cultivars or cultivar candidates, if you like, and you see if that survives. If it does, you get small tea plant eventually. And when it's 2, 3 years old, you can start plucking a little bit in spring. And then you can use those leaves, steam them, and process them into something that probably wouldn't call it, sencha, but something resembling sencha in one of those mini factories that you have at the Tea Research Center. And then what you do is you have the researchers, they do the tea evaluation and they realize that, oh, 90% taste awful. Let's just discard these. The other 10% survives or they get to survive. And what you do is then you see, oh, do they grow healthily or are they likely to, catch different kinds of disease like fungi and those kind of things?
Mm.
And so that's another like 2 or 3 years. Then eventually you multiply it. So you take cuttings. Now eventually you get like a small tiny hedge tea plants. So you can now process tea in the not the mini factory, but the just slightly tiny factory. And then eventually you keep repeating this. And after 10, 12 years, what you do is, okay, now is the time to actually let these cultivar candidates go and see what happens if we actually have them grown by actually tea farmers. So
Mm.
you look for volunteers, tea farmers that are interested in basically experimenting, sacrificing a part of their plot to try to grow these new cultivars. And
Wow.
you give them cuttings basically. And they're still called something like these 4503, whatever. Like they just have a number basically. And the farmers, they produce this. And so you if this is in Shizuoka, for example, you probably do this in a few mountainous regions, and then some you also experiment. You also want farmers to do this in more flat areas, so you can see how the tea plant behaves in both cases.
Different terroir.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because you also you need to make a decision. Is this going to be, cultivar for deep steam tea or like fukamushi, or is it going to be a cultivar for,
Mm.
high mountain or like high altitude places? So you have to take those kind of decisions, and you bring back all the data, you evaluate the tea, and then finally, after a couple of years, say, now we finally have this cultivar. It kind of tastes like chocolate or whatever. It's really unique. It tastes like nothing we have ever seen before, and it actually survives. It doesn't die every summer because it gets attacked by moths or whatever. So okay, let's give it a name and spread it. And actually, by the time that happens, probably at least 20 years have got past since you mixed, the pollen, from the Koshin flower with the Yabukita. So
That's crazy.
at least 20 years. So when I was at the Tea Research Center, that's 11 years ago now, which means whatever I bred there, if it ever gets registered, it's probably another 12, 13 years. So we're looking for new matcha cultivars, but we want it now, right? Because now matcha is popular, right? So you want
Yeah.
maybe you want a purple matcha or something, or maybe you want a matcha with I don't know, slightly floral herbal flavor. I don't know if it's possible or not, but if it is possible, I mean, it's going to take a long time to breed this, unless you do things like genetic engineering or something. I mean,
Mm.
with the current ways of breeding cultivars, it takes about 20 years before we can actually get all the results needed for taking the decision that okay, this is the one we're gonna register.
That's kind of insane to think about. For all the matcha that's been popular today, it was actually being developed like 20 years ago with a very
Yeah.
different mindset and
Yeah,
goals.
exactly. So there's time lag here. Quite amazing time lag, I think.
Yeah.
Is it possible to do some like cultivar arbitrage? Are there cultivars that exist in Taiwan or in mainland China or in
South
Korea
Korea.
that might just be very suitable for shaded cultivation and matcha processing? Because we've heard that Longjing 43, there's some Chinese producers, and we've actually tried some samples. I mean, it doesn't hold a candle to, at least the ones we tried, to anything that comes out of Japan. But, it also was like, wow, actually, this tastes like it could work if maybe someone, like, if a Japanese farmer had that cultivar, like, probably could taste good using, better techniques. But is there any, like, experimentation going on about, importing other cultivars that were developed elsewhere?
Well, I mean, if your question is specifically about matcha, I would have to, call the research center in Uji or, wherever they do research on cultivars for making shaded teas. But if we're just talking generally about Japanese tea, there's actually a long tradition of importing cultivars or different kinds of tea plants from overseas. I think the
Mm,
biggest way was probably during the Meiji period, when Japan modernized, because they imported
crazy to think about this was happening 150 years ago.
Exactly. You didn't see that one coming. Because at the time, actually, tea export was a really important industry for the whole tea industry was really important for Japan because it was one of the few ways they could actually gain foreign currency. The other big one was silk. But actually, the second
Hmm.
biggest export product at the time was tea. It was mainly shipped to the US and Canada, but also to European countries. But at the time, what happened was that the whole world market for tea was kind of changing in favor of black tea. The demand for black tea was rising, but Japan was essentially mainly producing green teas. And they try to make black tea. You can make black tea from, Japanese cultivars. And actually, this is before cultivars. This is when we have seed propagated tea. So, but
Everything's
anyway,
siren.
High lineages.
exactly. But anyway, the tea farms or the tea plants that they had in Japan were essentially better for making green tea. So what they did was they went to India, and sounds like a very simple thing to do, but I think a lot of people, Japanese people, they were actually risking their lives going to different mountainous regions in India to get seeds, basically from tea plants that were good for making or processing black tea. And they were introduced to Japan in a number of different places. They were planted in a number of different places, but or what happens is actually even now, if you plant Indian with the Asamika varietal in Japan is that it won't survive. It's simply too cold in Japan, especially in spring.
Oh, uh-huh.
Some places it's too cold in winter as well for the Assam plant, but it's essentially the spring with all the frost in March and so forth. That because the Assamica varietal tends to grow very fast. So what they did was they crossbred the Assamica tea plant with the Sinensis or the Chinese varietal that they've had in Japan for a couple of hundreds of years. And eventually we got things like or cultivars like Benifuki, Benihomare, for example. Any of the Beni cultivars, those are black tea cultivars with Indian DNA. So this actually this has been going on for quite a long time actually, and there has been a lot of cases where they've imported cultivars from Taiwan as well.
Hmm.
If you go to the tea research center in Shizuoka, you should ask them to take you to the, the kind of DNA bank greenhouse. It's a
Oh.
small greenhouse where they have tea plants that actually among them there are some of them that don't really look like tea plants. It's just it feels like I don't know place where they're making like genetic engineering experiments or whatever. But it's not. It's all natural, but they're tea plants from places like Myanmar, from China, whatever. They just keep them there just in case they'd be able to do something interesting. And a lot of them have been there since, many decades back, like some even like 100 years back or something. So this is
Hmm.
actually a long tradition, and I think it's more difficult to do now because nowadays, in the modern world, it's a little more tricky to import
Get
cultivars
seeds
and
in and out or
yeah, yeah,
cuttings.
people are more protective actually.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have, as you mentioned, like Longjing 43 or something, I mean, you probably want to keep that in Zhejiang or, at least in China if
Huh.
you're Chinese, and probably don't want, the Japanese to
Yeah. It's
keep
more of a business asset.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
This Meiji story sounds very much like a Japanese version of Robert Fortune, the Scottish botanist who took seeds from China.
But the other way, not into India, but out,
Yeah,
getting out India.
interesting. So, actually, nothing that we've talked about so far was what we had originally proposed to talk about, which we, which is always great. But the conversation we were having 2 weeks ago was so fascinating to me, it's still resonating in my mind, and I was giving a suggestion to sort of talk about the single origin versus blended concept. To put some color on that, just as a consumer trying to learn tea, kind of bringing in a specialty lens, I was really into Chinese tea and coffee, where, like, a sense of origin is super strong. Like, you can pretty reliably learn the taste of different regions or different cultivars. And getting into Japanese tea, spending all this money on uji matcha, and then very slowly, bit by bit, learning that most of the uji matcha I've ever was trying to associate a flavor with a place, terroir, was probably like mistraining. Like I was not drinking samples that were grown in uji. I was not learning terroir. I was learning like a blending style. And I really felt lied to just as a consumer, like that it's not uji matcha. And we learned that Shizuoka, I guess now is Shizuoka like reliably, but at one point it wasn't. And I've learned the same case for Nishio and some other regions. So I got really intrigued. Was Uji matcha ever from Uji? And at what point did it stop being from Uji? And you had such an interesting take that really took me back because even during like the Edo period when it was forbidden to grow matcha anywhere outside of Uji proper. And let me know if I'm mischaracterizing this, but your argument was it actually terroir doesn't really matter. It really has always been about fertilizer and processing technique that's driving these flavor profile outcomes. And that great matcha and Uji tasting matcha can theoretically be grown anywhere. And the magic is happening in the fertilizer and in the processing. Is that a fair characterization?
In short, I'd say yes. I mean, so tea in general, especially, well, Japanese, your steamed green teas are less terroir dependent or terroir driven, if you like. I think tea in general, though, we have to remember that when we drink tea, I mean, where are you guys right now? I'm in Tokyo. You're
In Paris?
you're in Paris, right?
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. So let's say we want to have the same tea, which happens sometimes. People do those kind of tea gatherings, right? And you're in different parts
Yeah.
of the world and you have the same tea, but it's not going to taste the same, right? It's 99.9% or so water, right? Give or take
Mm.
a few. So, which means that you're essentially drinking a lot of water. I think, first of all, it gets affected by the water we use for brewing, but not only that, processing is also very important. So, I think when we talked about this, I think I mentioned that. So, just to slide back to Sencha, because it makes it a little easier to explain this. So, for example, if you have a river, let's say the Abe River in Shizuoka or something, and you have tea farms on the east side of the river and tea farms on the west side of the river. And then you try the different teas and you say, oh, they actually, taste a little different. West side is a little bit more astringent and the other one's a little more sweet, whatever. And if you're new to tea or like sencha and Japanese green tea, you're probably inclined to think that, oh, this must be, the way the sun hits the tea plants, or it must be like exposure to sun or something, or
Rainfall.
local climate, whatever. So you interpret this as terroir, and I think it's quite a natural thing to do. However, it turns out actually that things are quite different. What happens is, so typically, if you travel downstream, kind of to the lower parts of the river, whatever, lower altitude areas, there's typically a tea refining factory there. Okay, so this where they do the blending, and it's also where they do the tea refining. So they have a style of refining, but never mind. Actually, there's a change even before that, because what happens is all of the tea farmers, or probably at least, if you're a tea farmer on the west side of the river, you probably ship your tea or hand over a large chunk of your production to the tea refiner on the west side. Whereas if you're on the east side, you probably, ship your tea or hand over your tea to the other tea refining factory that's on the east side of the river. So you have two different tea refining factories. And here's an interesting thing. So even if you're in the realm of sencha, let's say just for this, sake of the argument, everyone's doing like kind of orthodox classic spontaneous sencha. So it's like short steaming time. It's and they're probably using similar equipment as well, made by any of the big tea processing machine companies in Japan, or makers in Japan. That would be either Terada or Kawasaki Kiko. But let's say they're using the same, just for the sake of the argument. They're still going to taste a little different, but this is mainly because the tea refining factory, they're basically the ones calling the shots. They're saying like, "Hey, I want you to, steam this a little, not just slightly more, or like maybe you should roll this a little more. The fine rolling should be like, you should do that for a little longer, whatever." They do all the quality evaluation and they give the feedback to the farmers. So the farmers essentially produce the tea that the tea refiners want. So there's a certain style. So this is not, the sun exposure. This is actually, what they've been instructed to do. So if you tell the people, let's say the tea refining factory on the west side goes bust for some reason. So now all the farmers suddenly have to ship their teas to the factory on the east side. and they have capacity for this. So they manage to solve it somehow. But they're going to give new directions to the farmers. They're going to say, no, 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 actually, because we're making this blend here. So we want you to process this in a slightly different style. And eventually, both are going to taste the same, basically. So this has more to do with who they actually hang out with, as in who are they dealing with? What kind of tea refiner is in charge of the blending, and who's calling the shots, basically. So, and if we look at this from a wider perspective, if you have a tea plant, we already talked about black tea varietals imported from India, right? But you can still do make black tea from Yabukita or any Japanese green tea cultivar. So processing is more important than terroir, obviously, because you can make such different things as black tea and green tea
Mm.
or oolong teas, whatever. So we have processing, and then we do have things like weather, actually, because if we do get a lot of sun exposure, the tea is likely to taste more bitter. This is why shaded teas taste more sweet, because less exposure to sunlight, so more sweetness in umami. So we have processing, and we also have local climate, as in exposure to sunlight and altitude, those kind of things. But we also have cultivars.
Yeah.
And I think of all the things affecting the taste and flavor of tea, I'd put, at least for Japanese green tea, I'd put terroir quite low. I think
Mm.
it would be the last thing. So we start with processing, and processing includes things as, just slight differences in how you roll your tea, whatever. So it's not only, are you making black tea or green tea, or are you making, deep steam tea or light steam tea? Processing affects it all, and then cultivation too. And that's going back to our matcha topic, because you need a lot of fertilizers to get all that umami, to get those soft leaves with a lot of nutrition. I think, yes, you can kind of actually repeat this if you are in a completely different place. But then the question is, even if you have, the climate should be suitable enough for making tea. So you can do this probably anywhere in any tea growing region in Japan. But do you have the know-how? So this is, another aspect of terroir, in a sense, because when we talk about terroir, we tend to exclude humans, right? We tend to talk
Yeah.
about altitude, soil, those kind of things. But if you use the word or the notion of a terroir in a wider sense, you can actually include things like culture and history too. So, and Uji
Mm.
has developed, as they produce a lot of different teas, but to some degree, a matcha producing or a tencha producing region. So they have the know-how, they have the traditions, that they have the tea pickers, everything, basically. So if you include that in terroir, then yeah, certainly it is. But I think it's very different, from suggesting that, because the soil is this and that, this asahi tastes a little whatever. I think that's is really difficult to taste difference from different kinds of soils and so on.
Yeah, because it's so far down the list. And you said too, shaded cultivation is kind of a homogenizer. Is it even possible to build a deductive tasting framework to work backwards and say, this tea is from like Furukawa Seicha, or this tea is from Sujisan, or this tea is from Horishi Shimean, based on the taste? Like, can you taste for information and work backwards? Or is there not enough, like, facts to learn from and reference samples to build that framework to actually blind identify reliably?
Or like specific flavor is attributed mainly towards like cultivation, or it's from processing.
Yeah, or this is from this fertilizer, this is natural versus synthetic, or this is Tana shelf shaded or direct covering.
Very complicated question.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a very good question, and I think it's extremely difficult. First and foremost, I know for a fact that this is possible when it comes to sencha, because I know people, and including myself, we've been doing things like tea guessing and those kind of things, and sometimes you can even tell, oh, this is this person's tea, and sometimes you can even see the tea leaves, because tea leaves, they're kind of a giveaway, actually. If you have a whole leaf tea and you do tea evaluation and you're using all the necessary tools or utensils for that, there's no source of like misinformation, and you basically get what you get, basically. When it comes to
Mm.
matcha, it's milled, it gets really tricky. I think it's a very good question. Yeah, like you said, like all you named a few different brands or tea producers there. I mean there's certainly some degree of style there. I mean, like you mentioned Suji-san, for example. I think there's a richness in his matcha that is It's quite remarkable indeed. Um, I think it's more. I mean, well, he has his peculiar ways of fertilizing his tea farm. So I mean, but I think it's more those techniques actually rather than the soil itself. So if you want to
Yeah.
you want to backtrack it or like to see what's what, I think
That's such a good point. Tea leaf is such a good giveaway when it
it is.
comes to
It is.
information.
It is. It feels like cheating because you actually look at
Yeah.
the tea leaves before you drink the tea. So um, you get a lot of data just by looking at the tea leaves, basically. So
Yeah, you can't do that for matcha.
Maybe for tencha.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but tencha is also like fragmented. It's hard to see like the shape of the leaf. Like it's hard to deduct like different processing methods or cultivars. Anyway,
I think I
Very
guess
interesting.
I guess maybe that I feel like so matcha is more about well, it is there's a cultivar difference, and then it is about how you cultivated the fields basically. So because there's no rolling process, right? So and when it comes to teas like
Yeah.
sencha, that actually affects the taste and flavor a lot, like how it's processed basically and how it's rolled. Whereas in matcha, there's no rolling process. So I'd say the percentage of what happens at the tea farm as opposed to tea factory is when it comes to matcha, it's more about the tea farm, even more about the tea farm because it's not as processed as so. But having said that, I don't know. Maybe I mean, it's like people, and this goes for Japan in many ways actually. So back in the days when the tea from Togano was like considered to be the real tea, and all other teas were like copies, and they did these tea uh, guessing games, and when that was popular, I think people would try to copy Togano basically. So they're basically doing or trying to do the same thing, and I think that's happening now again. Maybe if people become even more experimental, whatever, try to do different things with matcha. I mean, that could be like anything from cultivars to processing, and I mean, there might be things we can do here. We don't realize it because it's been because everyone's trying to do the same thing, and that's how they've been doing things basically for decades or even longer. So there might be ways of making your matcha taste a little bit more unique. If we're excluding flavoring here, basically, we're saying that it has to be, only the taste from tea, not adding any like flavoring or any other ingredients, then I think I mean, there might be things you could do, but we're so focused on, or I mean, we as in not me because I'm not a tea farmer, but I mean, tea producers have been focused on making things kind of more or less in the same way because that's been the definition of a certain type of tea or a way that things have been done. There's a lot of tradition in there. So.
When you were referring to the period where they're doing these guessing games, I know that at some point in history that this switched. Like at some point, single origin mattered. People cared. You could say there's market demand for it, and it actually was single origin. And then slowly over time, that did not become the case. So presumably during the Edo period, when it was basically a state-controlled oligopoly of different families or clans who were given the license to produce tencha and matcha only within Uji. What was that history? And then how did we get to where we are today, where you have all of this blending going on and that concept of origin was lost, even though the consumer perception for it was not, perhaps.
I
yeah,
think maybe in this case it's helpful to realize that I mean, or to separate the modern notion of single estate, single origin, and why we are enjoying it in the first place from traditional, single origin way of thinking. I think actually when it comes to the Edo period, I think it's a lot of, kind of similar to a brand or something. Or actually, this isn't the feudal, so we don't have you mentioned there was an oligopoly system. Basically, there are only a few places that are allowed to or licensed to use shading for the tea farms, basically. So this is not a free market, and I think maybe this is more like actually decided beforehand what's real tea and what's not tea. I mean, regardless of taste and flavor. Whereas In the modern world, I think it's more like, okay, so we have, back to our Sencha cultivars, we have floral cultivars like Koshin, we have, the more classic ones like Yabukita, and they all taste very different. And I think, you know, we're not saying today that, this Yabukita is the real tea and all other teas are, fake teas or like not good enough. We just say they're different, right? And I think that's a very modern approach. It comes from, things like wine and also third wave coffee, whatever, and has kind of like slowly entered the world of tea or the world of Japanese tea as well. So we see the same phenomenon going on, but this is very recent. So, I mean, this has been going on for about 30 years now. So
Yeah.
most teas basically were all teas were blends basically. So any of the, we've been talking a lot about cultivars and you mentioned some, you know, tastes and flavors from different cultivars, but essentially cultivars were bred not for the purpose of giving tea a different flavor or taste or something, but actually you have early cultivars, late cultivars, and middle ones because you want to spread out your harvest basically. If you only have one cultivar, all your tea has to be plucked, at the same time. And that's just going to clog your tea factory, and your leaves are going to start withering and degrading long before you're even able to process everything. So that was the original idea with cultivar breeding. Then at some point, a few people realized that, hey, wait a minute, they actually taste different. And I mean, this people who were into tea refining and also researchers, they knew this already, but people start realizing, hey, maybe we can do something like they do with, chateau wines, for example. You have, this Merlot from this particular place, and it tastes like this because, and of course, in the world of wine, we have the whole notion of the terroir as well. But just to make it easier for us, I think basically what people wanted to do was to offer a product or a tea that actually tastes different from all other teas. And maybe you can only produce this in small quantities. So let's say maybe you only get like 20 or 40 kilos a year. But hey, here is a tea that actually, tastes very different from all other teas. And then from there, we have now a multitude of, different senchas, different, green teas. And I think now because we have all this, we feel like, and especially if you get into tea, let's say if you're, from the US or Europe or something, and you start getting into Japanese tea and you drink a lot of different teas and you explore the differences and you find single cultivar teas and single estate teas. And then at some point you ask yourself, why isn't there more of this? Because
Mm.
this is so interesting. This is like, but then you have to remember that that's a very new approach to Japanese tea in the first place. So only 30 years ago, everything was blends and no one thought about making, single cultivar teas. So all this, thinking about enjoying different tastes and flavors is a very new thing. So what about the Edo period single estate or single origin
Mm.
teas? Well, first of all, they were very different because they didn't have cultivars. So if we want to call
Oh,
them
right.
single estate teas or single origin teas, we can do so, but we have to, at least just to get our definition straight, we have to realize that they were not single estate teas in the same, way as modern teas are, because they didn't have cultivars. They had only had zaidai or seed propagated teas. So they were essentially a mix of different tea plants, kind of natural blends already. And so I wouldn't expect, if you could travel back in time and go back to the Edo period and try different teas, I wouldn't expect them to, you wouldn't find one tea farm with a floral flavor and another one with, forest-like flavor. I think they'd be pretty similar actually in flavor,
Mm.
but there probably was some difference because they process it differently. And this is before, standardization and those kind of things. So before tea industry
Right.
modernizes, I mean, now we have more or less the same kind of equipment, for or processing machines for producing tea. But I mean, back in the Edo period, this is a lot of handmade stuff, so it'll taste a little different. I mean, this would be like, you know, try to make the same, I don't know, bolognese or something, or
Twice.
any given dish. I mean, you probably make it slightly different from the way I make it. And even if we try to use pretty much the same recipe, then it's going to taste a little different. And why is it different? Well, I mean, maybe you're using a different kind of salt, and your spices are from a different place. The meat could be from a different place. I mean, there's so many factors here. And I think back in those days, there's probably no, I mean, even if there was an oligopoly system, I don't think there was, like a modern institution, people going to all those tea farms, instructing them exactly on how to fertilize the tea farms and so on. I think I mean, information travels a lot slower back in those days. So I think they're going to be a little different for a lot of different reasons, but essentially because it's handmade. Do we want to call them single estate teas or single origin teas? We can, but I mean, it's a very different thing from what we expect from single estate teas today.
Do you know when they started opening up and like having tencha brought in from like Wazuka, Ujitawara, Joyo Town, like Ide Town? Because there's a lot of people now that will label like Ujitawara or Wazuka tea and claim it to be Ujicha, which I was originally very skeptical of that claim because a modern single origin lens, it's not from Uji, right? Like, how can you call it that? But then there's this historical argument that it was like the backbone of these blends. What's your take on that? Because to me, I think like let's just not call something what it's not. Like if it's from that place, let's call it from that place. We can learn what that place is. It has its own merits and demerits, its own style, its own history. So like, what's your take on like even answering like what is ujicha? Right? There's a legal definition. There's the spirit of it. There's consumer perception. What's your take on that thread?
Well, so the legal definition is it has to be well, it's tea from 4 different places essentially, and it's not only from Uji but the entire Kyoto prefecture, and also the neighboring Shiga, Nara, and also Mie prefecture. So 4 different prefectures. And I think if you travel to Uji, which by the way everyone should do, it's a lovely little town, and there are a few temples and shrines here, well worth visiting as well. And it's very close to Tokyo's proximity to Kyoto. Sorry, makes it very easy to travel there, and so there's really no excuse. But one thing that would probably strike you is that there are not that many tea farms. If you looked at if you were to look at a picture from central Uji, taken in the 50s or something, actually they did still have quite a lot of tea farms. And the reason that they don't have so many tea farms these days is that because of the proximity to Kyoto, and also because they have other assets, as in famous temples and so forth. They have a lot of people traveling there. People live there. If you go to a mountainous tea growing region, place like northern Shizuoka, whatever, any mountainous part of Kyushu or something, there's no reason to build an outlet or any like commercial
Urbanization.
whatever. Like there's no reason to build a parking lot, for example. But there's actually reason to build a parking lot. Maybe you can make more money from just paving the ground, turning it into a parking lot if you're in Uji. So the whole map surrounding tea farming in Uji is very different. But even if you go back to say the 50s or even pre-war times, as in before the Second World War, I mean, even when they had a lot of tea farms in central Uji, they still wouldn't be able to make that much tea. As in, they can't supply the great demand for Uji tea. So this is essentially, I mean, they do grow some tea, but Uji is mainly or essentially a name of a brand.
Right.
It's a tea that is made in a certain style. They use, as for the leaf tea from Uji, they use a lot of shaded teas. So Uji tea has a sweeter flavor profile if you compare it with the Shizuoka tea, for example, which is more astringent in comparison. So Uji is basically the name of a brand. And I think from a modern perspective, we react to this saying, hey, I feel like I'm being lied to because, Uji is a city or like, location. I wanted Uji tea, but, then you get this blend. And most of it is from Mie, which is like a completely different place. And they actually grow a lot of tea in Mie, but most of it is shipped to Uji instead of getting sold as Mie tea. So, but that's how you feel because you're a modern person. You're a modern tea enthusiast. That's not how people felt previously because people felt you buy tea. Buying tea is like not buying from a farmer. Buying tea is, buying tea from a tea refiner or a wholesaler or something, with a brand. And the taste and flavor is guaranteed by that person or that company, basically.
Hmm.
So, and that used to be the main approach to tea, basically, back in the days.
Yeah. The flavor was created by the chashi, not by
Exactly. By the
the
Chashi,
single
not
origin.
the tea farmer.
Very
It's
interesting.
quite interesting. Like there's a lot of nuances like in all of these concepts, and like it's really what really matters is like single like what like single origin or single in state, or for the matter like we should probably talk about like single factory or like
Yeah,
single
maybe.
like plant or single style. Like there's so many things that's going on
I think single
into
factor is not bad at all, actually, because there is a style. I mean, they have all those cooperatives, and there's always a head of the factory, and he does definitely, because it's typically a he most often. But anyway, they affect the taste and flavor a lot, I'd say. So, but yeah, it's an interesting thought. I think the whole way of thinking when it comes to teas like Uji. If you're in the tea industry, you don't feel like you did anything bad. It's like you just it's business as usual. They're like, we've been doing this for hundreds of years, and
Yes.
blending is part of it. And then now suddenly you have the single origin people that are complaining about things like transparency and stuff, but it was never an issue. I think actually maybe I'm being a little cynical here, but I'm thinking back, back in the days, and we travel back in time to the Edo period again when they had the oligopoly system. This means that only a certain number of tea farms can grow shaded tea, right? How do you actually check back in, this is like 200 or something years ago?
yeah.
How do you,
Yeah, that was also my question too, because like there were three types of chashi, right, that were allowed to do
yes,
shaded
yes.
cultivation.
But
Like,
actually,
what were the relationship between those chashi and the gardens?
so
Like,
the
they
big
have their own gardens, or like how did it work?
No, so the number of tea gardens actually, if you look at history, has like swung back and forth. So at some point it was like 39, at some point it was 35. So that number has changed, but they all had to be associated with any of those three chashis, basically. But
Okay,
I'm thinking that what if you because look at what's happening right now. We have a matcha shortage right now, right? And when things like that happens, quality is, I think it's really hard to maintain quality because a lot of people out there are tempted, you know, to blend their good matcha with bad matcha. Would you
Mm,
notice if you add 1% of whatever, something?
yeah. It's elasticity and fungibility in the supply of blended products.
Exactly. And I think, so many things are happening right now that were completely, thinkable just a couple of years ago. Matcha is supposed to be kind of stored and matured um, until fall. October,
Mm,
that's when you
yes.
start shipping your matcha. And a lot of matcha producers still do. But I also know that a lot of people just ship their whatever they had in spring because there's a matcha shortage and there's a frenzy now. So suddenly we have young matcha, kind of whatever you want to call it, and that's very irregular for the Japanese tea market. That's one thing. Another thing is that blends, they're adding more second harvest teas, more fall teas, more teas that are actually not matcha, just other powdered green teas, especially when it comes to, all the blends and so forth. And I think this is just going to get worse and worse in the sense that it's going to be really difficult to tell what you actually have in there. So, but I mean, that said, of course, there are reliable people out there still. But if we travel back in time again to the Edo period, what do you do if you have a matcha shortage in the Edo period? I mean, I'm thinking that maybe there's a tea farmer there. Maybe we can do some shading and we can just say that he's associated with us, whatever. I mean, there must have been loopholes. I mean, and how
yeah,
how do they control this even? Like, do they have tea police or like tea samurai
at
police
least.
checking, oh no, I think that's some shading. You got some shady business going on there.
Yeah, it must be. I mean, like, because like later during that period, there were these they call it heichashi that kind of emerge in outer skirt of Uji area that kind of represent the more peasant level tea farms that can also do shaded cultivation. So maybe at some point that kind of got out of control, and the government just said, okay, you guys can do it too.
I mean, if you were associated with the right people, and there might have been loopholes there. But I'm not saying this. I don't know for a fact. I'm just thinking that systems change and governments change, and feudalism is very different from you know uh, political system that we have in modern Japan, which is more like capitalism oriented. So, and I still think that, essentially humans are the same. We're the same. So, and we
Mm,
react to whatever happens, in our environment and on the market. And just because the market operates differently doesn't mean that, people don't.
very good point.
There's the official history, but how are we gonna write the history of matcha now? We tend to forget that we're also like in a way living in history. Like in 20
Yeah,
years,
we're
30
part of
years from now, someone's gonna write the book about the matcha boom or the matcha frenzy that happened in the 2020s. And how do you write that history? And what were people drinking? Were people drinking traditional matcha, or were they just drinking powdered green teas and just call them matchas? And how do you even do this? So if you go back in time, then we have the official history that says that there was like a license system, or you had to be like a designated place where in order to shade your tea or tea farm. But it's humans operating, not like a perfect.
Mm.
I mean, that's my greatest critique actually of the traditional system, which I totally respect, by the way, and like all these old chashis and blend houses. But it's a system that's set up to remove a very interesting human story. Like the farmers, the processing, the cultivation techniques, the cultivars, right? Like the modern, like if you walk into a traditional blend house, everything about the product positioning and the experience is to abstract away any human decision that was made and give it a poetic name. Even the chashis aren't that celebrated. You don't see very interesting stories of chashi from this blending house or that blending house talking about even the relationship between the flavor and the poetic name. Right? There's even a really interesting human story there about why we named it Yame no Shiro or something, or Uji no Shiro, or all of these different names. Let alone the processing, the blending, the aging, the refining, the production techniques. It all gets erased. It's not the point. And like the specialty movement of these single origin, single cultivar products is really ultimately discovering one very interesting human story about the intentions and the decisions that get made at each point. And like even like with your brand, Senchaism, right? Like it's about these cultivars, it's about these farmers, it's about these stories. We can talk about how Koshin got created and why and how and
Yeah,
why it's
there's a lot
super
of stories,
interesting.
by the way.
And in the traditional matcha world, it's all erased. It's interesting how that do you see that swinging? Do you see these traditional companies changing the types of narratives that they tell? Because the consumer preference base is very different. I mean, you have a declining Japanese tea ceremony practitioner base. I think even in the last, like, what was it, 15 years, it's moved from 2 million to 1 million in Japan. I forget the exact numbers, but it's huge. It's not growing abroad. So you have a very different consumer base that cares about very different things. Like, do you think that switch is going to happen, or do you think it's going to be super slow? Like, how do you see this evolving?
Well, I think first and foremost, when it comes to traditional matcha consumption in Japan, it has mainly been for the tea ceremonies, right? And interestingly, because I've been practicing the tea ceremony as well at some degree, and one thing that I found very interesting was that after a tea ceremony, you always look at the different utensils, the chawan, the tea bowl, and also the tea whisk and so forth. And typically the whole conversation is kind of oriented around talking about which style the different things are made in and so forth. But you don't really talk about the matcha so much. So I think matcha has been, of course, it's the center of the tea ceremony, but it's not, it hasn't been enjoyed in the same way as you would enjoy, an old burgundy red or something.
Mm,
And I think not like some oolong teas or leaf green teas that are more like inspiring you in their direction of, being poetic, whatever, and, gives you a lot of associations. I think matcha has been more simple. And as such, there hasn't been a demand until recently, for great variations or, the story of the farmer behind the matcha. I think that's changing now. And I can definitely see it changing here because I think we already mentioned Tsuji-san, right? Kiyohara Tsuji. I think that's probably the most famous matcha farmer out there. And I think he's probably a sign that everything is about to change or has changed already. I mean, because y- until a couple of years ago, you would never hear about any farmer. You only hear about, Marukyu Koyaman or Yamamasa Koyaman, or like you have those refiners or wholesalers, whatever you want to call them, that sell the matcha. They have their farmers, obviously, but they were actually very particular about not, letting their farmers, giving their farmers any space in media, for example, whatever, because they see it as, matcha. We're making matcha. Like
Mm.
their perspective is like you, as in you farmers, you're only making like parts. It's like BMW or some car brand. Suddenly, you have all the people. We actually made the, this thing for the engine, or actually we made, this, which typically doesn't happen, right? So in the case of matcha, I think that has changed a lot in the last couple of years because you have people or farmers like Kiyoharu Tsuji. You have also you have some farmers who have their own like tea cafes or tea places where you can have matcha, and that wouldn't happen like 15 years ago or so. This is very new, so it is changing, and I think the tea industry has gotten a little softer, as in I think it's a little friendlier now. They were
Okay.
extremely protective back in the days, and I can feel it too, actually. Because I've been here now for I've been in Japan for more than 10 years, and I feel like there is a new generation taking over, sort of, because a lot of tea wholesalers, they used to be very conservative and very sensitive about it. And even for leaf tea too, they wouldn't, want you know people to visit their farmers, and there's kind of afraid that the farmers will just start selling directly. That's of course one thing they're worried about, but also I think that it's almost like a question of ideology or something. It's like for
Mm.
a lot of people in the tea industry, and this includes people with a certification. Like, so I'm a certified Japanese tea instructor, and I think that for a lot of us, we don't consider aracha or like raw tea as we don't consider it a product really. So this is like not like religion or ideology or anything, but it's something that we're so used to thinking in those patterns, and it's a question of definition. So for a lot of people, I think that stretches not only as far as tea refining, but also to blending, which
Mm.
means that to have, tea farmers appearing on your TV, or, talking about their teas, or tea farmers selling their teas, or tea farmers, you know, being in the limelight basically is something that a lot of people don't approve of. But I think that's changing. It has changed. It already changes because, I think that fortress was breached many years ago now. And it's it kind of feels old and, overly conservative to be protected like that in these days. So I think it's changing, but then again, you don't know because now we have the matcha shortage, and I think now people are going to be protected for different reasons because everyone's fighting
Yeah.
whatever is left there, and it's going to be harder and harder to um, sell tea from a certain place because I know for a fact because I've been talking to a lot of farmers and people involved in matcha, and they said like actually, so they can get matcha, but they don't want the farmers don't want them to tell the people that it's from a particular place because they're also selling matcha to other places, and
Uh,
you don't want I think Tsuji-san, he's different in the sense that he's already got a brand, right? It's his tea, and people don't
yeah.
put their own brand on top of his brand. In general, there might be exceptions, but and if they do, it's like their brand and then Tsuji-san. But let's say if you're not him, if you're another matcha farmer, I think maybe you don't want your name all over the place because people will start comparing prices, and people, especially
Yeah.
your wholesalers, and this is a little different from the overprotective.
Reverse engineer.
It might be a little weird, yeah. So because you might find, let's say you have a tea shop in, I don't know, let's say somewhere in in a capital in Europe where they sell tea from, I don't know, let's say it's in Marikyu-Koyamaen. And then they also have, from a certain farmer that supplies tea to Marikyu-Koyamaen. That's a weird position for the farmer and also for Marikyu-Koyamaen. And I think they're going to have a problem, like an internal problem. So in order to avoid this from happening, I think a lot of people are going to, or a lot of farmers might opt for, especially in places like Uji, like traditional places, they might opt for selling their matcha, but with the promise that you don't actually put the name. So we're going to have a lot of single origin teas out there, but we won't be able to tell where they're from. Or that might be the case. I can't say that it's going to happen for sure, but I've seen the trend and I've heard about this phenomenon. So I think it might actually be happening.
It's interesting.
Very interesting.
One thing that I'm thinking about in terms of like really looking into the future of matcha as a specialty product, because it's very much a product of the world, considering how many people have real love for it, is moving part of the value creation closer to the consumer. And can we have a very interesting and creative world of people blending matcha? Because I refuse to believe, and to my knowledge, almost all chashis or old Japanese men have any clue what a teenager in Saudi Arabia wants, or what someone in California wants, or what someone in Mexico City wants. It's just beyond the capacity of such a narrow demographic to truly understand the preferences of other people. And what would be really cool to see, and curious what you think the structural barriers are, to have people do their own chiage processing. So they get access to aracha, they have access to the commodities market, do their own chiage processing, blending, and if they have the capacity to mill, do their own milling to create hyper localized versions, just like we see different coffee roasteries roasting green coffee from all over the world, creating a blend that people like, know their consumers, and can deliver something that they would love. Like, what are the structural barriers from that happening, and would it be a good or bad thing for the industry in Japan?
First of all, there's so many layers here. I mean, the teenager in Saudi Arabia there or the hipster in California or whatever it was. I mean, it's a positive thing that people discover tea and matcha, but I think that if you look at it from the perspective of a person doing tea ceremonies in Japan, maybe you've been practicing the tea ceremony for 15 years or 30 years or something, and suddenly you just find yourself in a position where your matcha is like twice the price, whatever. That's for you, that's a very negative experience, right? This might be good for the tea industry, might be beneficial for the farmers to some degree, but it's not necessarily good news for everyone, right? So that's one aspect of it, and I think that we tend to overlook very often. I think, I mean, I'm not saying to people out there stop drinking matcha. I'm just saying savor it a little bit more. I think it's a little like too trendy now. And I think, yeah, pay more attention to, the taste and flavor and savor it more. And at least don't overindulge. But I mean, that goes for anything, I suppose, but certainly so for matcha because it's so popular right now. But then when it comes to, bringing out more different flavors, and because like you mentioned, the teenager in Saudi Arabia it might have a different palate than, the traditional Japanese old man working at a tea refining factory. So, well, of course, you could, give people stone mills and you probably, have a lot of smaller factories. I think it's kind of happening already because part of the matcha shortage is actually not well, I mean, now I think we have a real shortage, but the shortage last year was more a stone mill shortage, basically. So you have the stone mills working 24/7, basically, driven by electricity, but I mean, apparently it's still not enough. So people are building their own stone mill factories or like jet mill or ball mill factories just to compensate for or make up for the shortage. But and I think at some point, yeah, it might be the case that if you start making more single cultivar matchas, and like I mean, you get more options if you have your own, or you're likely to get more options if you have your own milling factory, and you can choose to import different kinds of matcha made from different cultivars. So it might be positive in the sense that we get more different flavors if that's desirable anyway, if that's considered desirable. I think we might be going in that direction. I think also we shouldn't overlook, because we're talking about Japan. Obviously, I mean, I've been living in Japan for a total of 13 years, and I mean, full disclosure, I'm part of Team Japan here, so I mean, I'm caring mostly for the tea farmers and everyone involved in tea here. But tea is like a huge industry, right? And spans over several countries. And I think what's happening now is like matcha is from having been a Japanese kind of tea, now it's kind of international thing. And, this huge production volumes are huge in countries like China and even countries like Vietnam and Thailand, they're making matcha now. So I think matcha is not something that is entirely Japanese anymore. So, and just by that happening, I think the market is like getting more diverse and for good and for bad, because I mean, I know that a lot of those, and I think most people know that, most of the foreign matcha is there to supply the matcha latte demand, and it's not necessarily the greatest qualities. But then again, that's the beginning of it. Might change for reasons that we can't foresee because we're focusing on what's happening right now. It's like in Japan, like people are thinking about should we maybe quit leaf tea and switch to tencha, because it seems like the wisest decision to do now if you have resources to build a new factory, and if you're young enough to um, at least have the prospect of being able to make tea for a couple of decades to come, then it sounds like the reasonable thing to do. But then again, what's going to happen in 10 years, 15 years, like 20 years? It's going to be as
Yeah,
popular
you
as
never
it is
know.
now, or, and foreign production volumes are going to be like, what? Absolutely no idea. So I think
Mm.
it's going to be more diverse, partly because what you said, like that people probably going to move the whole distribution system is going to be different. Like people will have their own milling factories. There's really no need actually to mill everything in Japan. It's actually might actually be better for the quality if it's more freshly milled in Paris or Rio de Janeiro, wherever it's supposed to be consumed. So yeah, might actually make for a more diverse and a more interesting matcha market.
In terms of the tea production situation with the whole matcha popularity and matcha boom, do you see farmers switching to more towards tencha production, or do you see that kind of popularity kind of transcend or cascade down to consumptions of sencha or other Japanese leaf tea? How do you see the dynamic that's happening right?
I think a lot of things are happening at the same time, so it's a little hard to say that because of A, we have B. I think there's a lot of things, a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration. One thing is, first and foremost, there is definitely a movement among tea farmers that consists of them trying to produce either a tencha or making anything that can be used for making a powdered version of green tea. So we don't necessarily need to restrict the discussion to traditional matcha, but any kind of powdered green tea. So that's certainly
Mm.
happening. But I'm also sensing that, I think because of the interest in not only matcha, but I think in Japan in general, Japanese food, Japanese culture, Asian culture, like in many not Asian countries, but also, if you're in Asia, like I've been traveling to countries like Indonesia and Thailand to do tea lectures and tea tasting sessions, and Japanese culture is extremely popular, or that's my take on it
Mm.
anyway, after having visited a couple of times. And I think matcha is certainly popular, but I think a lot of people are looking for like the next thing, partly because there's a matcha shortage. So matcha is getting more expensive, and partly I think because that's how we operate basically as humans. We something gets popular, then we move on to the next thing, and or like very often we explore a similar genre, or and I think the difference is, of course, like is of course that when it comes to matcha, you can drink it as a latte, or you can mix it with sweets. You can't really do that with sencha, but or kabusecha or gyokuro, or any of the leaf teas for that matter. So you need a teapot, and it's a different process. I think my take on it is that people that drink leaf tea are to a large degree different type of consumer or different type of tea person, but there's also a lot of overlapping going on there. So you can't really say
Mm.
for sure. And I mean, you have people like me. I've been drinking matcha now for more than 20 years, but probably been below the radar. But you have those kind of people. I mean, I know I'm not alone here, so I would drink my matcha, just whisk it and enjoy it as it is, basically, without any, almond milk or whatever people use to mix with their matcha these days. But I think it's I mean, there's a growing interest in leaf teas as well, and that's partly, but not entirely fueled by the matcha boom. So I'd
Mm.
say it probably comes from many different directions, but certainly, I mean, the popularity of matcha, because it's so ubiquitous, it's like so all over the place. You probably more likely to find people among those matcha drinkers that are like, hey, what's the next thing? And a lot of people are discovering hojicha. I think that's probably next thing for a lot of people.
Yeah. Although I do think the matcha trend, I think trend might almost be the wrong word. I think it's going to be a little more sticky than most
I think
people
you're
think.
absolutely right. Yeah, yep, yep.
Because it's someone we interviewed, Erin, who runs a matcha business, Matcha U in Australia, said something that really changed my perspective. She does like a lot of markets, and she said like the number of young teenagers, especially teenage girls, coming up dragging their parents, say, "Mom, Dad, I heard about matcha. I want to try matcha. I saw it on social media." They're forming a very different relationship with caffeine at their most formative years. If you look at like becoming an adult, like one of the things that we do is we drink caffeinated beverages, as at least most adults. And they're totally skipping over coffee. And they're going to carry that habit into adulthood. And if you think about the easiest group of consumers to underestimate, it's this younger demographic
Yeah, certainly.
who are totally skipping the coffee. And I really worry that Japan and the Japanese tea industry isn't taking it seriously enough because the way it's presented to them are a bunch of, TikTok girlies posting their beautiful drink. But I actually think there's a much deeper preference behind this we'll call vanity, consumption vanity. And that, if Japan can't keep up with supply, then it's a really big missed opportunity.
I think you certainly have a point here. I mean, that's my feeling too, because I visit tea growing regions a lot, and some of them are more keen on exporting, and some of them are more kind of in touch with reality, if you like, or like current trends, or see where things are going. And leaf tea is getting more popular too. But I think that if you speak to a lot of farmers and people out in the countryside in Japan, they are already so, especially the places where they make leaf tea. And I've heard this too from the Kansai region, for example, where a lot of people have succeeded, from producing matcha, and now matcha is really popular. So the farmers who didn't make matcha until now, they feel like losers, right? They're
Mm.
um, losing out or missing out on this, great opportunity. That's what we're saying right now. I think Hojitsu is going to get more popular. Sencha is going to get more popular, and we just don't see it right now because we're so focused on, what's happening right now and what's big right now. But I think that, as you mentioned, the especially younger generations, and that's something that I've felt too whenever I go overseas. I feel like my audience is, 'cause I just turned 40 a couple of days ago, but I've been drinking Japanese tea for 20 years now. And I'm happily and pleasantly surprised to see that a lot of 20 somethings are showing up at my tea events.
Mm.
And it's not something that I expected really. I felt like, green tea is something that you discover, I don't know, maybe in your late 20s or something. And, after having a couple of years. And I mean, there are many different or different reasons for entering tea, and especially green tea and oolong teas and pu'er, those kind of specialty teas thing. But that those kind of genres. But I mean, could be for health reasons, could be because you have an interest in Asian culture or whatever. But in any case, I felt that's something that people discover when they're at least in their late 20s, and they have stable jobs, they got some money to spend, maybe they can travel, and they find this new interest. But actually, what I do see is that unexpectedly, there are a lot of people in their 20s, or, a lot of young people. I think it's a very positive thing. And like you said, what's her name again? Erin, the Australian lady that you talked about.
How much are you?
Yeah, I mean, she certainly has a point there. If people are skipping coffee, I mean, if people don't start drinking coffee when they're, 15 or whatever, and start drinking matcha instead, then we're going to have a completely different world in 10 years from now, because those people are going to be 25, 26 something. And, they will keep exploring the different teas out there. And it's certainly interesting. I think we're living in very interesting times. I remember when I had my second book published in Japan, the bilingual book about Japanese tea. It's a lot about, cultivars and different kinds of
Blue
Japanese
book, right?
regions with a lot of maps and so forth. And I got so much positive response for it by tea enthusiasts. But I can tell you there weren't a lot of them. It's really popular among people that are really into Japanese tea. But now I think it's very well spread. And now there's an international version of it as well, published by Tom. They have presence in many
Mm.
different countries. But I feel like in a way it was a good timing to write a book like that because now the world is turning, and what has turned like in favor of Japanese tea. And you see a lot of young people, people that I didn't expect to get into Japanese tea at all in the first place. And I mean, I didn't know that. I didn't see that one coming. And I think it's a very positive thing. So, I mean, if my activities are any sign of good things happening, I'd say that, things like, well, if you look at the number of books sold, those kind of things, I feel like there's an interest out there, certainly, definitely so
Yeah.
for Japanese tea. And
That's such a interesting firsthand experience
Yeah,
about
you
this
were through this whole
very
wave personally.
the curiosity of tea or knowledge.
yeah, I think it's even a lot of my friends who were like, yeah, it's a very nice book that you wrote, but who's gonna read this kind of like.
Interesting. I had the exact opposite impression when I read through both of your books, and I was thinking, "Wow, this is fantastic information," but I wish it went 10 times deeper.
Yeah.
But I think, that's gonna start flipping. There's gonna be more people.
Well, I can actually tell you a secret. Well, it's not going to be a secret if I tell you here in the podcast, but I'm working on it.
Uh,
Yay!
Very cool.
Nice. Wonderful.
Very excited for that.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
a good place to end.
I mean, we should definitely do this again. I'd be more than happy to join you guys again if you
Oh, we'd love
if you
that.
get the
Definitely.
opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, it's we learned so much from your perspective. I've been kind of incubating a few ideas in my head, and I really loved hearing your reaction to some of them.
Thank you so much, Oscar, for coming.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so
Thank you for
much.
having me, and I hope to see you guys again.
Really appreciate your time. And thank you to our listeners as well. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing it with a friend, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.
See you in the future.